Reginald here. My mods aren't working, at least not the ones I usually use for stuff, but the good news is I did all my testing beforehand, and that's what this video is about. We're going to dive deep on all of the testing I've done to show off the different types of melee weapons and how they stack up against one another, see if anything stands out, and make some recommendations on how things should be balanced going forwards. If you've not seen my introductory review of how I handle this protocol for testing, it basically goes like this. For each weapon, I test against 4 Crushers, 50 Poxwalkers as a separate attack, and 20 Scab bruisers. I also do a mixed group test with 30 Poxwalkers, 10 Scab bruisers, a Dreg Rager, and a Mauler, just to get an idea of how it performs in real mixed circumstances. It's important to note that I measure the times as a barometer for how effective a given weapon is. The times are measured from the first hit impact to the final hit impact that kills the last target. I exclude any stray Poxwalkers that might have got stuck on terrain and require time to go run and hit if it's only 1 or 2. As much as is possible, I have avoided taking any health damage. Occasionally I take a little, and unless it's enough to really matter for the test, I don't redo the test. For the case of the Scab Bruiser test case and the Poxwalker test case, I do not use Chastise the Wicked, and I do not do so on purpose to avoid any kind of interaction with a weapon that might change the baseline performance. However, I do use that alt ability whenever fighting the Crusher group or when fighting the mixed group, and that I do it in the way that I find is best in that fight. Sometimes I have to use it to avoid getting hit by a Crusher, and if that's the case, then I consider that a demerit against the weapon. Ideally, the weapon would be able to use it entirely for delivering damage. Also, I am aware there is currently a bug with Thrust, where you cannot stack Thrust and then utilize Chastise the Wicked. I have attempted to mitigate that where possible in my testing, but it is not always possible. Odd note on the weapons, I have used, to the best of my ability, whatever the best in service weapon blessings are, but I have not used the appropriate in all cases feat types for the weapons. Instead, I'm creating a baseline that can be tested against reliably in all cases. There are probably some feats that parallel some blessings that I'm not taking advantage of that might boost the weapon's potential above some threshold, and I don't know necessarily what that is because it's just the first pass-through. Let's go ahead and show the different weapons that I'm going to be able to use. You can just take a screenshot of this if you want to keep it on hand. I'll only leave it up for a little bit. Now, you might be wondering why these weapons and choices rather than, say, something better or whatever. Just a reminder that I only have limited resources, even though this is the character I play the most often. And so I've done my best with the RNG system that is available to get a wide spread of popular builds and test a few things out that seemed interesting. I haven't tested everything out because, of course, I don't have the best in class for some things. For example, I don't have the best in class for the heavy sword combo for an MK9 variant with the right blessings. I just have the sort of second best in class, so you'll have to just tolerate what's there. But you can imagine, in a lot of cases, that the trend line is from the data is only going to go more in line with what the weapon, just better. So there are some things that are obvious in the way that they perform, and I think you'll get to see that. Let's not tarry any further, and let's pull up the first set of data. Since we're already looking at me fight a bunch of Crushers, let's see what the data looks like for that. Let me explain this data for you. So I've color-coded it here, based mostly on my discretion, on what kind of weapons are close together in time. Any kind of gap there is how I sort of use this, the dividing line. It's a little up to my opinion here, but I feel like these weapons are similar enough to be in the same category, broadly speaking. Additionally, this time column here is going to be in minutes and seconds and milliseconds. I know I'm using commas, but the software I was using, which is OpenOffice, was being a little weird about using the proper notation. It was giving me some weird results, so I decided to just make it easy to read for myself. So that Atrox TAC-Axe, that's 1 minute, 39 seconds. Difficulty represents mostly how many attempts it took me to actually successfully do this. But really, the real meaning of this is, did I actually have a hard time completing this mission of killing X number of targets in this time or not, without taking any damage, mind you? The goal is to take no damage before completion. In some cases, I took damage right before finishing it or whatever. And in that case, I decided to just complete the mission for time and allow me and just sort of, chalk that up to this is hard enough, but not impossible. So I'll give you a couple of examples. So, the chainsword video we're watching right now, in that one, I actually can't complete this. I've tried it a bunch of times, and I can't even figure out how I would complete it. Same thing with the Catachin sword. I don't have any stagger resources, and I'm doing hardly any damage. It just takes so long that I'm likely to die before I ever get the chance to kill these crushers. The Iron Helm as well, even though the time on the Iron Helm was pretty good, it was actually really hard to achieve this. It took me on the order of 30 tries, and that's what I consider to be hard. Anything that took me that many tries to do, considering I'm pretty decent at this game, is in the hard category for me. Anything that's in the medium category means that I've got good stagger resources and good dodges and good dodge distance that make it easy to mitigate the risk of the crushers hitting me. Whereas something with a large commitment, like a chain weapon, tends to be a little bit worse. The chain axe, of course, being pretty hard, though doing good damage. The eviscerator is decent, given the longer range of its attacks. The chain sword being basically impossible. The Iron Helm is hard. Just to double down on this point one quick time, the difficulty is not the same thing as how much damage I'm doing. The Iron Helm does a ton of damage to crushers, and it can quickly eliminate them in terms of time, but it's not safe to do it. It's really hard to complete this task without taking damage, and when fighting crushers, you usually take significant damage, and I see that obviously as a downside to a given weapon if that's the case. There's another element of this that I'm judging as well, so, like the Atrox one we're watching right now, it's not hard to fight these crushers with this weapon. What's hard is to actually kill them in a timely manner before other stuff shows up and ruins your day, right? So that's why it's medium and not hard. This is like my third attempt. It wasn't very difficult. But I can show you what I mean by this being relatively easy, since I'm able to continue to fight these crushers while getting bamboozled by a mutie. I know I did a lot of talking there, so let's get back to the data and just explain what kind of results I got from this data, what's interesting or stands out to me. So, and I'll let you watch me get blown up by a bomber at the end of this. So, first of all, the Atrox Tac Axe, in this case, does not perform very quickly, but isn't that hard to use either. The stagger's a little low, so it has some drawbacks compared to, say, the Antax. And the heavy swords are also slow, but they're relatively safe, and they have decent enough stagger, kind of like the Atrox Tac Axe, so they're okay. The Eviscerators actually perform fairly well overall. Like, it's not super easy, but their standoff distance makes it a lot easier to shred targets without dying, and their time to kill is definitely a lot shorter than either of those upper level ones. The Catachin MK1 and the Chainsword, I can't complete those. I tried a whole bunch of times. The Catachin sword I gave up pretty quick because it just does like no damage, so it was just going to take forever, and I kept dying. But the Chainsword, I tried a lot. I kept trying different techniques, using thrusts, all sorts of stuff, and the best I could figure out was use thrusts and still die. So that's why that's marked as difficulty hell. The Chain Axe is hard, but not that slow. And that's because of the headshot bonuses being reliably accessible and using your ult when sawing to get quick kills. You can actually kill crushers in a couple of normal hits, but you can also kill them very quickly with a special attack in there, so it's quite nice. The Indignatus was faster than I expected, by a lot, actually. The Indignatus crusher being so fast against crushers made this nice. The only reason that it's marked as medium is because it's actually fairly unreliable at staggering those crushers. I just sort of spammed the special attack, and occasionally they would just change their mind about being stunned and hit me anyway. So you had to really watch out for that, and you don't have a lot of dodges or good dodge distance for that, so it can be tough, but definitely doable. With a little practice, I think I'd get even better at it, but I still consider that a medium. The Iron Helm took me so many tries to get done, but was pretty fast once I did. And that's with the thrust bug in place. I did my best to leverage the thrust behavior against charges, but it's hard when there's that many crushers challenging you at once. So I could probably get a shorter time if I could use thrust while, charge up a thrust and then charge with Chastise the Wicked. The Antax is by and large the outlier in all these tests. This was my first try. I then replicated this a bunch of times. I then tried it against 8 crushers. I found this super easy against 8 crushers in these tight conditions. So then I thought to myself, why don't I try it against 10 crushers in crappy conditions? See, being in tight conditions like this has some drawbacks for crushers since they can kind of phase through one another. But man, When you get them in open terrain, they can come at you in as many as 5 at a time. So if you're doing 10 of them, that's 2 times the maximum number that can surround you. So you're really going to be fighting to stay alive. That was harder, but definitely not hard. I would consider killing 10 crushers with an Antax to be a medium tier feat. Now I'm going to do a full conclusion section at the end of this, so let's not get too deep on this subject. You've seen my data. You can draw some of your own conclusions as we go along. And I want to do that in comparison to the other data that I've presented. But let me just say, this crusher result is bad for the game. The Antax, a normal one-handed axe with a second hand on the half, should never in a 40k game be capable of killing crushers this fast, this well, or this safely. It shouldn't be like this at all. That's just not good. We'll dig into that a little deeper, but it's really not good for the game. There's a lot to say in the crusher section and a lot less to say in the other sections, so before I leave, let me just add, this example is a failure example, so you know what I mean when I say this is a medium. This is what it looks like for a medium to fail. There's a lot of these because it's actually fairly hard to get a safe result, but it's not nearly as hard to get a safe result with the heavy sword as it is with the Iron Helm. Let's talk about the Scab bruiser results. Now, they have no flak on the head, so they're unarmored there, and they have flak on the body. And usually, with some weapons, you're going to hit some of both, unless you have a perfectly horizontal swing, in which case you can hit just unarmored, unless you're a little dumb like me, and you swing and hit the wrong thing. So that's kind of why I chose this target, because I feel like it's fairly evident when you're hitting flak. It makes a good sound, so you can tell in my videos when I do hit some flak, and it will definitely change the damage profile. That's also why I used a mauler in the mixed group, so that I could tell if a weapon was especially bad against flak or something like that. In this case, the weapon results don't really surprise. I don't think anyone's going to be looking at the outcome of these tests and being like, whoa, how could this have possibly happened? It's fairly straightforward what happened in these videos, and the results are fairly clear. Just like everyone expected, the combat axe is the best, except for maybe the heavy sword being a little better with those headshot advantages. The eviscerator and the attack axes and even the Catachan, although that's a little surprising, come out on top due to the headshot advantage here. The next slowest, and not substantially much slower. In fact, the Iron Helm surprises me a little bit, not being that slow. The Iron Helm, Chain Axe, Chain Sword, etc. are all kind of there. And then we end up in the land of pretty slow with some of the eviscerator techniques used, with these light attack only eviscerators and the Indignatus Crusher not being all that good. So, there's your results. They don't surprise in my opinion. I think everybody basically agrees what the best and worst weapons are in this category. So I think that's enough said. Let's go look at Poxwalkers next. All right, now for Poxwalkers, the data also more or less aligns with the expectations one might have going into this. So the good news is all of our instincts were basically correct. A couple of things that I want to call out are the Catachan MK1 actually performs quite decently against Poxwalkers. And so it seems like more or less the arc of effectiveness goes in the direction you might expect with the Catachan as a mundane weapon and some of the other mundane weapons. But I'd like to draw your attention to just two things that did surprise me just a little bit. So the light chain axe attacks and the heavy chain axe attacks, as the resident chain axe connoisseur, I had to try it, were about the same, like pretty much precisely the same in time to kill. But it's harder to use light attacks. So against Poxwalkers at least, use your heavy attacks. One of these days I'll have to test that against Groner groups and just see if lights are better in that specific case, with the added cleave advantage you get using light attacks with all the plus power stacks that you can get on a chain axe. The other thing I want to draw your attention to here is actually the Antaxes. These are the two combat axes I did test. Now, there's no doubt that Antax 2 without brutal momentum is slower against the mob of Poxwalkers, and it is a little harder to use, but not that much harder to use. The main thing that I want to draw your attention to is that it's not that much worse. It basically falls in line with all of the chain weapons in sort of the bulk of chain weapon gameplay and the other attack axe when using heavy attacks instead of light attacks. So I've heard a lot of people say we need to, nerf brutal momentum for the combat axes or nerf brutal momentum in general, and that it's like such a big problem. But in actually replacing it with a different blessing, in this case I believe I used Shred, it doesn't impact it that much. And I think that reality, that it's not such a huge impact, is important to call out. I think that we are looking at the wrong thing when we're talking about what balance effects we need to do when we're looking at brutal momentum. Yes, it's probably the best blessing, and it definitely helps a lot, but I'll explain my thinking here on what we need to do with the combat axe later. In the conclusion section, I just want to draw attention to this fact really quick, that the brutal momentum is not what makes or breaks the combat axe in this game. Well, we talked through almost everything except for one thing, the mixed results. And the mixed results are a little, well, mixed. I don't know that they necessarily elucidate anything interesting compared to these other results. These other results are consistent and give us things that match our expectations and only defy them in a few places that are interesting and then can be verified by further testing, like, for example, the anti-axe being good against crushers. The mixed results don't really have that same thing. I'll put them up here so we can see them, and I'll talk to them to the best of my ability. Alright, so the first thing that I think is fair to say about these results is that they're not super consistent. And part of that is the issue with doing the actual test and having some variable terrain results and getting pushed around with some weapons more than with other weapons and things like that. So it's not an apples-to-apples comparison to the same degree that the other tests are. And that's best highlighted by the Antax 1 with brutal momentum doing 8 seconds worse than the Antax 2 without brutal momentum. I really think that's down more to how I played that particular run and the fact that maybe I eliminated those elites a little earlier rather than eliminating those elites a little later. And, you know, the thing that's really probably clear here is any weapon that really struggles to kill a particular target tends to land in the longer time frame. So, like, the Iron Helm with its ability to kill elites faster is great, but then it struggles on the rest of the horde, whereas the chain axe is just kind of slower in general. The Indignatus Crusher, of course, struggles to kill everything all that quickly, as does the Chainsword and the Catachin MK1. Both of those are slow on elites. The latter two are slow on elites, and the Crusher is just really slow against hordes. And so because of that, those have the longest times by a fairly long margin. That, I think, is the best you can say about these. The ultimate truth of these is none of these are really bamboozled by a mixed horde. I think you can reasonably, if you're a skilled player, take on a mixed horde with any of these weapons and get through it without taking significant risk or danger or damage. But there are definitely some sticking points that come out for weapons that don't have an easy way to deal with heavier targets like Ragers and Maulers, or are especially slow against hordes like the Crusher is. I guess the last thing I'll say about the mixed tests is if we are able to do a lot more tests, we might be able to find a more consistent pattern and do some verification of some of my results. But right now I'm not confident to use these as any more than a guidepost, a limited sort of feel-based orientation of, hey, the weapon is kind of like this and it can definitely take on a mixed horde. Beyond that, I'm not satisfied with anything other than maybe the really slow weapons in their performance differences. I don't think they're big enough to really draw any conclusions about which weapon is better. I think we have to rely on those earlier tests with Crushers, with Poxwalkers, and with Scab bruisers to say how good a weapon is in melee or not. Alright, we've seen the data, we've talked about the data and how sort of I have analyzed it, what things jump out at me, that kind of stuff. Let's actually get into the conclusion. The results of these tests are not especially exciting, which is, in my opinion, kind of a good thing. It means that all of our general opinions, instincts, and expectations were met by the results of these tests. If they had been like wildly outside of expectations, something probably would have been wrong, right? I don't know what that something would have been necessarily. It could have even been our opinions, but the point is, because it relatively aligns, the power levels of the weapons relatively align, that's a good thing. It means the test is at least reasonably reliable. It's not perfect by any means, and I certainly didn't do a large enough sample size to really average things out, but it's close enough to give us some guideposts. So, that's number one. Number two is that there were some actually interesting results. There were a few things that definitely surprised and allowed us to conduct additional tests to verify, like the Antax being quite as good against Crushers as it is. And that information is very useful to us if we want to try and make good, accurate recommendations on what kind of balance changes need to be made for the game. Because what we want to do is make the game as fun as possible for ourselves and for anybody else who joins us in this little adventure we call Darktide, right? So that's our number 2 point. Now there's one last thing I think is worth mentioning as a caveat to all of this before I really jump into the meat of the issue here, which is if you have a weapon that is good at a specific task, but is bad at another one, that doesn't mean it is a bad weapon just because it's bad at that other thing, right? You have two weapons as a player. So, and the perfect example of this is the heavy sword, right? The heavy sword is widely considered in the player base to be one of the best, if not the best, weapon on the Zealot. And the reason for that is it's really good at killing almost everything, and it's certainly not awful against maulers, right? Or crushers or anything like that. It's not great, but it's not awful. The thing is, it doesn't need to be good against those targets because you can just take a bolter and kill them really easily, and then who cares? Now you have a weapon that's really, really good at the niche that it's in, which is killing most things that aren't heavily armored and heavily armored elites, and then when you run into those few relatively rare key targets, you can just use your bolt gun. Or, I guess there's a couple other weapons, but bolt gun is the best example. The same is true for the Iron Helm, for example. I know I didn't test the Crucius, but the Thunder Hammers have the same problem, which is they're really quite good, at least in terms of time to kill and high damage, against elite targets, right? They're really bad, or at least medium bad, at those lighter Poxwalker groups. But no problem, just take a Flamer or any other good Horde clear secondary and you're good to go. It's not really an issue. So this is why I'm saying, hey, just be aware that just because a weapon is bad at a specific category doesn't make it bad overall. If it's really good in the category that it's designed for, that's good enough to take it. And I think everybody already knows that, but I just wanted to make it a call out. And let's actually use that as a jumping off point to discuss what makes a weapon good or bad. From doing all this testing, I would propose the following ideal criteria for the best weapon, quote unquote. It should have good defensive mobility, that's to say good dodge count, good dodge distance, sprint advantage is a plus. It should have good breakpoints. That means, the fast time to kill against the ideal targets for that weapon, great damage. And by good damage, I mean, it hits all the key breakpoints that the weapon needs to hit to be considered in its lane. And then it should be good at most or all targets. It doesn't have to be good at every single targets, but if it is weak against a given target, it should be like one or two weaknesses that are easily filled in for by the secondary weapon. It should then have high stagger, ideally, because you want a weapon with high stagger to make you safe against more difficult targets, right? That's how you keep things safe. It should have a high swing speed because that's more forgiving, right? If you can swing your weapon more quickly, you can respond more quickly to new and emerging threats as they show up. The slower your swing speed, the harder it is to do that. You have to plan ahead a little bit to make your swings work for you. And then you would want no self-effects from usage. So any kind of lock or stun, like the lock would be like when you do a revved attack using your chain weapon, and a stun would be like you use the Iron Helm and it self-stuns you, right? Those are obviously a demerit against the weapon. Although, personally, I think they're very fun, and I don't want to get rid of them. I'm just saying, the ideal weapon doesn't have those. This is a 40k game, and it's really important to make that clear here. I understand the heritage of this game from Vermintide, but Vermintide is a medieval combat game, and this is a 40k combat game. This is very important because the 40k IP has to inform how the balance of this game works. So let's just compare sort of the results that we have to the results that you might expect from a 40k game, because they're very different, and I see that as a problem. And I'm going to sort of break down where those problems could be easily fixed as my sort of recommendation component to this conclusion section, because this is really the meat of the issue to me, that there is a disconnect in the weapon design, especially in the melee weapons, far more than there is in the ranged weapons, for the melee weapons not feeling like 40k weapons. They're just not right. And they're close. They're not that far away, but they're enough far away that it's really unpleasant for most of the players who come to this game expecting a 40k game. You have to remember, this is a 40k game. It has to appeal and pay homage to the IP. And that doesn't mean you have to throw all of the balance out with the bathwater, but there's an expectation that certain things are going to run a certain way, because there's an entire game behind this that explains how these things are supposed to work. So, all right, I've drawn a very simple MS Paint graph. It's not meant to be graphically precise. It's just meant to represent the feel of the game relative to what it actually is with my data. And then I'll show you another one, which is the ideal. To be clear, I'm using effectiveness in this graph as sort of a combined measure, roughly, and this is by field, but roughly of difficulty with the time to kill built in. So if it's relatively easy, it's not like in the hard camp, and it's effective enough that counts. I know the chainsword is like really bad against crushers, and I wasn't able to complete it. But like I'm trying to talk in generalities here without getting too precise in all cases. But I did want to break out the power weapons because all the power weapons have fundamentally different characters. So I don't want to be lumping them all together with like the power sword or the hammer or whatever. It's just not the same thing, right? So this graph represents the ideal. This is, roughly speaking, how the weapons should be balanced if they were honoring the lore of the 40k setting as it's been communicated to us over the last, 20 years, 30 years, however long it is. And it should be accurate mostly to how it works on tabletop, to how it works in the Fantasy Flight games. You know, there should be, there's a sort of hierarchy at play here that should be honored by this balancing system. So if we look here comparatively, I'm just going to put them side by side so you can see, we can see where the things are way out of line, right? What's really making no sense right here. And I'm not saying we need to totally revamp the whole balance of the game to match this graph. A lot of the things they've done with the game are actually really fun. So for example, I like the chain weapons are a little more effective than carapace than they maybe should be, right? It's kind of fun that they can do that. But I don't like that, say, the combat axe is this god tier weapon that acts as basically a power axe in all situations it's used in. It's way too good at the top end. So this ideal distribution is meant to sort of preserve the character and style of the game, recognizing that this game is not a exact ideal copy of tabletop and shouldn't be for the sake of its own fun and enjoyment, right? It should be a homage to it. It should have some representation to it. So, you know, the chain weapons are a little overperforming here against carapace armor compared to what they should do. And that's okay. And some of these weapons are going to perform a little better in some places than they might in tabletop. For example, there's not really a lot of difference in close combat weapons in tabletop, but I think we would all agree that we'd like the axe to feel different in gameplay than the heavy sword, than the catechin sword, than the knife, right? Otherwise, what's the point of having all these different weapons? So they need to have some room, some wiggle room for character, and I've tried to encapsulate that in this sort of impressionistic painting version of my graphs. In classic Reginald fashion, all of that was just a lengthy conclusion prelude to the actual key details of the production here. But I did think it would be valuable to bring you along with all of this stuff I've been thinking about and trying to work out for myself on the balance and how it should work. Ultimately, I think the problem here is that Fat Shark has built a melee weapon system that doesn't align well with 40k lore, and the consequence of that is when you get into the game and you pick up the bolt gun, it feels awesome, or the las gun, it feels awesome, because that does align with 40k lore, and they're pretty good weapons. And when you pick up a power maul or an iron helm, you know, thunder hammer, and you hit something with it, it doesn't feel good, or the chain weapons especially. So I want to solve a number of problems here, and I think that shouldn't be too hard to do, so I'm going to make some firm recommendations. Problem number 1, the combat axe is OP. I said it because I'm right. Sorry, Combat Axe fans, but this thing is just way too good in every dimension, in every domain, and most of the popular suggestions for how it should be nerfed won't change that. It's also way out of line with 40k lore, just badly. There are 2 possible fixes for this, and I think I'm open to either of them. It doesn't really matter to me that much. What's important to me is that we get a good, lore-accurate, and fun outcome. So here are my 2 proposals. Proposal 1 for problem 1, which is the combat axe being OP, is to rename the combat axes power axes and give them the appropriate special effects. You don't need to do anything with the whole special activation nonsense. Honestly, I've never liked that for power weapons, and I've made many proposals to have them just sort of have power field always on effects. So in this case, my proposal is give it always an always on power field and just let it perform the way it performs, exactly as it performs. That would solve the entire problem, in my opinion. You just give it some special effects and let it do what it's doing, and now it's a power weapon. Bam. Fixed. The second possible solution is probably going to be unpopular, but it is likely the right one for the combat axe solution, since we'll probably want to leave open the possibility of a real power axe someday that has different performance dynamics. So, first of all, we want to bring the combat axe back in line with the rest of the mundane weapons, since it shouldn't be too far removed from all the mundane weapons. Here are my proposals. We're going to leave Brutal Momentum alone, because Brutal Momentum makes the combat axe better at dealing with hordes, which is where combat weapons, close combat weapons in 40k are supposed to shine. They're mundane weapons. They're not particularly good at dealing with heavy armor, but they are good at dealing with basic tier units in large numbers. So the fact that an axe can do that decently well is totally fine. Alright, what we need to do then is nerf it against carapace. I know that this is a video game, and in video game logic, axes are good against armor. But in real life, axes aren't all that good against armor, any better than any other bladed weapon. Better than maybe a sword, but not always. They don't really slide very well between the plates, and plates don't care about your axe. Well, in 40k, carapace definitely does not care about your normal-ass axe, alright? They just don't care. The carapace armor can totally stop a bolt gun round. You think your axe won by your weak-ass arm is going to make a difference? No way. But we're not done there. We're reducing the damage against carapace, but we also need to reduce stagger against crushers and other unyielding or ogren-type enemies. Anything bigger than a human needs to not be easily and repeatably staggerable by just a heavy attack to the head. Right now, that makes the combat axe way too safe to use, and probably the Atrox tack axe as well. Like, we probably need to look at the whole class of weapons and make them a little less safe to use against these larger targets. I'm not saying we need to go all out, but the mundane weapons shouldn't be using their stagger effects to defeat these heavier targets. They should be centered more on mobility. That's just the way I would be balancing these weapons in general, and it makes sense. It's the same way, essentially, that the ranged weapons are designed. You get more powerful weapons, and they do more damage and stagger, but you lose out on the mobility that you get for those lighter weapons, right? Draw time, stuff like that. So that's how I would handle that. Additionally, and really important, the special attack from the axe should not be stunning any Ogren-sized enemies. It's totally fine for it to be stunning Maulers and Ragers and whatever else, but it definitely shouldn't be stunning any Ogrens. The 700-pound Gorilla Man does not care that you thrust your little pokey axe at its head and it bounced off its armor. It would just keep trucking, which is great. That makes the game more fun now that you have an actual challenge. I mean, you've got a bunch of dodges to use with these axes. Why not use them? Problem 2 is the chain weapons, just all together. The heavy chain sword, the chain axe, and the chain sword are not very good weapons. They're not awful or useless, but they're definitely towards the back end of the whole pile, and that is because they're essentially bad weapons that trade all of their effectiveness for a cool special attack gimmick. And the special attack gimmick is really cool, and it does hit like a truck, so you'll get your reward out of using it if you can pay the skill cost for using it. The problem is the basic attacks that they have aren't any good, and a couple of them have a latch of their own, a lock latch, but also don't pay off much for that latch. They're pretty weak on that front. So we need to solve all of those problems with the chain weapons. The solution for these problems is as follows. The chain weapons should be as good as mundane weapons against unarmored and infested, and maybe a touch better against flak. And then with the special attack, but not necessarily with the regular attacks, they should be better at the carapace armored and unyielding targets and maniac targets, but only with that special attack. The normal attacks should have about the same damage profile and sort of their fall off of effectiveness as the rest of the mundane weapons. Essentially, chain weapons should be thought of as mundane weapons with just a little better penetration against flak, except for when they use their special attack. The payment for this is in the reduced mobility that chain weapons already have and the latching behaviors that already cause a lot of risk. Any latching or locking attacks with a second tick of damage, that is a shred, needs to also have an improved damage. I sort of lump this in the category of improving the damage generally, but it does need to pay off if you're going to take the risk on every light attack with the chain axe, so make sure it hits hard enough to account for that. The final fix for the chain weapons is a critical change to the rev behavior damage distribution. This is really important to me now that I've sort of played around with the other chain weapons a little bit more after having spent some time with the chain sword. The chain sword currently is the only chain weapon when using a heavy attack after revving special, which will deal full damage on the first hit, and then follow that up with some smaller ticks of damage, and then end on a high tick of damage. The result of this is when you hit a light target of damage, it is often enough to kill that target outright. This feels really good, and it makes it so that when you hit a Poxwalker or something like that, you might only deal 1 or 2 ticks of damage before being free to swing again, because of course you are hitting them with the revved chainsword. When you do this with any other attack on the chainsword or any of the other chain weapons, you actually deal something on the order of like 3 to 13 damage for the first tick of damage, and then you do like some middle tier damage like in the 80s or 100s or whatever, and then it finally gets a really big payoff at the end. This means that when you hit a groaner with your eviscerator, well, okay, your groaner with your eviscerator using an overhead attack or a light attack rev attack, despite that enormous weapon hitting the weakest enemy in the game, you will saw for the whole duration of the saw before finally killing that super weak target. This is a huge time investment in this situation where you may have missed something you were aiming for, when it should just kill them outright like it does with the chainsword. So this needs to be addressed. It needs to be changed promptly. It's one of the main reasons why the chain weapons don't feel good, and they would immediately make them feel a lot better without changing the character of one of my favorite things about the chain weapons, which is these assassination type attacks that you do, which require commitment and risk to achieve, because it's dangerous to do this in a horde, but it's also really satisfying to pull off. So I'm not saying we should get rid of it. I'm saying we need to improve it. Problem 3 is the way that power weapons are kind of doing badly in various ways. Not the power sword, mind you, the other power weapons. The eviscerator, for example, doesn't exist. The thunderhammers do badly because they aren't really all that safe to use, while not really delivering that big of a punch. It could be quite a bit more in line with the lore, in my opinion. Yes, you can meme build them to do very specific breakpoints against certain hard targets, but they tend to suffer somewhere else in exchange for that, and so they tend not to be very versatile weapons if you build them like that, and that's not good. And the Crusher is just, honestly, so garbage. I mean, if you look at the results, all it manages to do is be kind of decent at killing a large group of Crushers, and not even that decent. There's better choices, right? So I think we need to look at that weapon as well. For problem 3, we have 3 prongs to our solution here. First of all, for the Eviscerator, give me an Eviscerator. I need that Wower field. Let's go. Big paddle swings. Come on. All right. For Thunderhammers, I want to see the special attack buffed a bit in terms of damage. This goes especially for the Iron Helm. I think we're a little too weak here when the Bolter is heavily outperforming the Thunderhammer on killing Crushers. The Thunderhammer is going to be a Strength 6 weapon that ignores the armor of the Crusher, the Carapace armor. The Bolt Gun is a Strength 4 weapon against a Strength 6 target, and it has no armor penetration in current edition, and it wasn't enough to bother Carapace ever in its history. And unless we're using some sort of special ammunition, which, I mean, sure, maybe, it's still going to outperform. It's going to be outperformed by the Thunderhammer, so it should really feel like it's being outperformed by the Thunderhammer. The last thing is the Crusher, the Indignatus Crusher, really needs a better horde clear. It should be better than the Hammer, in my opinion. It should be quite a bit better, actually. The way I see it, if you give it kind of what it has right now as a power weapon, that's fine. But it needs to be useful against those unarmored targets with better cleave damage distribution to go along with its stun effects. I think the Hammer can be more of a single target focused weapon, but the two-handed Power Maul, when swung unpowered, should feel like a weapon designed to kill groups of enemies. I think the two-handed weapons in general aren't that good and are kind of underperforming relative to what a two-handed weapon should feel like in the first place. So this would be one of the ways to address that problem for this. In fact, that's problem number 4. Problem number 4 is that the two-handed weapons in Darktide are all underperforming the one-handed weapons. Generally speaking, the one-handed weapons have superior dodges, mobility, dodge distance, etc., and the heavy weapons gain very little in the way of a damage bonus, and I don't see that as a viable way to balance your game. The two-handed weapons are much slower in swing speed and everything else, all of the opportunity costs, so they ought to have a commensurate advantage to killing multiple targets and being your main frontline weapons over the one-handed weapons. One-handed weapons are typically your backup weapons in real life, and your two-handed weapons are your main frontline weapons. So, let's treat these weapons the way they're meant to be treated, as big bruiser weapons that do a lot of damage but are a bit slower as a consequence, and require more skill out of the player to get safe advantage out of. That would make this a lot more fun. So, more damage for two-handers. And with that, I am just happy to say that I am done with this presentation. I have completed all of the analysis, review, and recommendations that I wanted to say. So if you have any disagreements with me, feel absolutely free to put those in the comments. I like to read the comments, and we can, chat out what you might like to see in terms of balance changes that are different from what I suggested. And if you disagree with my data, that's totally fair. My data is limited in its capacity to be gathered and is certainly not the cleanest data I've ever gathered. It's experimental data, and that's very useful, but it's small sample size, right? So I'm aware of that weakness. When Fat Shark decides to actually start updating their game again at the end of summer, because they're going to be on summer break for a while, I presume we'll see some big balance changes. When those big balance changes come along, I'm going to try and generate a Google Doc for us all to start doing these tests and sharing the results together. That would give us a much more reliable set of data, and we could do it for more weapons than just my one zealot is capable of generating. So we could start doing some averaging and figuring some stuff out together. That could be a lot more fun and give us much more reliable information about what would be good to recommend for changes to the product that makes the game more fun for everybody. I think we're all just looking to have the most fun playing the most fun 40k game we possibly can. So, I think that's a reasonable thing for us to attempt. With that, I will just say thank you all again so much for visiting. I really appreciated your company as always. And, if you're interested in some of the stuff from Next Fest, I'll be putting those out soon. So stay in touch. Bye.